We are Locked On Houston Astros, and we hope that you join us for a daily Locked On Astros podcast. My name is Eric Heisman. You can find me on Twitter at Eric Talks Stros. You can find the show at Locked On Astros, your team every day. Brett, where can you find you at?
They can find me at H-Town Wheelhouse on Twitter and at Stros411 on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Always positive, always Stros.
Have you ever opened a baseball pack and you're like, I want to get everybody's autograph? I don't know if you've ever done that. I know I've gotten some players' autographs over the years, but I've never looked at it, just actually made a trip to do that. And that's what our guest today, Brad Balukjian, sorry if I butchered that, but he wrote a great book called The Wax Pack. And as soon as Brett's done with it, I'm going to go ahead and jump on that. But what was your motivation to not only write the book? I know the book is not necessarily about a baseball card pack, but it's just about you wanting to make a trip to kind of do that. And I guess before we do that, where can you find you on Twitter? Sorry.
But yeah, sure. So I'm at Wax Pack Book. You can follow me there.
Okay. So what was your inspiration to let's talk about the trip before the book.
Sure. Well, thanks, Brett and Eric, for having me on. I appreciate it. Yeah, so the idea behind all this came from being a kid, like so many of us, and collecting thousands of baseball cards back in the 80s, going down to the store and getting a pack and ripping it open, chewing that gum. So I had, as a kid growing up in the 80s, I had my favorite players, and I was definitely a weird kid in that my favorite players were not the big superstars. And so I liked they called them the common cards. I was much more interested in just trying to think, for the Phillies, the team that I grew up watching, it was guys like Don Carmen or Bruce Ruffin that I really liked. I was not so much the big stars. And so I always wondered as an adult, what happened to those players, when they were done playing baseball? What do you do with the rest of your life when you're done in your mid 30s? And I had the idea that it would be neat to get a pack that had never been opened, that had been sealed all those years, from my childhood. And whatever guys were in that pack, those would be the guys that I would go on this massive road trip to track down and tell the story of life after baseball. So it started with me literally getting a pack and saying, okay, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And to me, the road trip part of it was because I could sit in my house and call people, but even before I took the trip, I knew that I wanted to at least try to write a book. And I knew that a book that's set on the road, going across America, going through 30 different states over 7 weeks would be just a much more interesting book than if it was just a bunch of interviews that I did from my house on the phone.
Yeah. And when we see guys out there like the super fan, like Marlins man who goes to all the games and he's front and center behind home plate, everybody knows that dude is like, he's got stacks and stacks, right? I mean, he's got the ability to fly around. He's got the ability to get those seats. And I mean, we're not talking to someone who is this jet setting hedge fund manager that's like, oh, I'm just going to be this playboy millionaire and I'm going to go seek out all these stars. I mean, you're really kind of just one of us, a fan. And I thought that was pretty admirable. Now, was there any agreement that had to come from family to be able to go out and take this trip? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's part of, I was lucky, and I'm a single guy. I'm not married, no kids. And so, and I have a pretty simple life like you're getting at. When I was taking this trip, I was teaching part-time at a community college, making $30,000 a year. So this, as you're saying, I was not staying in the Ritz-Carlton on this trip. I was trying to think of a good example since this is an Astros show. So the guys from the 86 Astros, that era that we're talking about, I would have, if I grew up in Houston, I would have been a huge Bill Doran fan or a Billy Hatcher fan, versus Mike Scott or, one of the big star players.
I was
Just to
thinking
give you,
like Tim Bogar for my generation, like Tim
yeah,
Bogar or like even Jeff Blum. I mean, he wasn't like a big star, but everybody seemed to like him too.
yeah. But to your point, Brett, yeah, I had no book deal. I had no guarantee this was going to work, so I had to foot my own bill and just believe in myself that I could pull this off.
Yeah, that's definitely a recipe for success. I'm looking at some of the guys that you interviewed or that you wanted to interview. Did you who was your most okay, who was your favorite person to interview? And I know I'm assuming you had to get several rejections, maybe before you got yeses, or maybe some guys accepted right up front. But who was your favorite person that you interviewed from that pack?
Well, so I spent about 10 months in advance of the trip doing all the research, which almost kind of is basically like stalking when when you get down to what you have to do for this kind of thing. But I was actually really surprised by how many guys were willing to talk to me. Before the trip, a couple of guys said no, like Vince Coleman and Carlton Fisk. But even for those guys that rejected me, I refused to be deterred, and I actually on the road came up with all kinds of really creative ways to try to get to them. Like with Fisk, I pretend like I'm a millionaire home buyer to sneak into a golf course in Florida to ambush him on the golf course. So I did a lot of crazy things
Wow.
in pursuit of the story. In terms of my favorites, what makes it hard to answer that is how overwhelmingly open these guys were in talking to me. And really, this book, if you like baseball, you'll love the book. But even if you don't like baseball, you'll like it, I think, because it's really about vulnerability, and it's about these men opening up and sharing stories that I would never have expected to get. Like, and some really weighty topics about abusive fathers and divorce and drug use and these things that are really about being human, not just being a baseball player. And so their willingness to go there with me was what made the book really into something even bigger than I expected. In terms of my absolute favorite, it would have to be, I mentioned this guy, Don Carmen, who was a pitcher for the Phillies in the 80s, who was my favorite as a kid and who was in the pack. And the guy's just so exceptional. He's so different than most baseball players. His job now is to be the psychologist for Scott Boras, the agent.
Mm.
So whenever Boris's clients, like Bryce Harper or the Steven Strasburg, these guys, when they go into some kind of a slump during the season, Don Carmen's job is to go wherever they are, fly there, and basically be their therapist. And so getting his perspective again was about a lot more than baseball. It's really getting into the psyche and the psychology of us as people.
That was amazing. I didn't know that they had people like that. That like, hey, Bryce Harper's struggling. Can you go fly down to Philly and kind of help him
Yeah,
out?
and right, and the reality is everybody struggles, right?
Right.
Bryce Harper is going to have slumps during the year, and so what Don Carmen told me that's interesting is that so now teams often have their own staff psychologist, but a lot of times the players don't want to talk to the team psychologist because the team psychologist, like let's say you're going through something that may give concern for your performance down the line or in the future, that team psychologist works for the team. They may go to the front office and say, hey, this guy's, this isn't good. Whereas if it's through the agent, through Scott Boras, all that information is kept private from the team.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you're working and the company's like, we want you to go to the company
Yeah,
doctor, and then they write on
exactly.
the report back discomfort.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So,
Exactly.
so I've got to ask. You mentioned Don Carmen, and you went to the zoo with him. What was that? Who came up with that idea? I mean, you
Yeah.
were just like, hey, you want to go to the zoo? Is that how you had to get him to interview you?
Well, it was my idea, and I think it's because him being my childhood favorite. To me, the zoo like evokes everything about
Oh,
being a
okay.
kid, right?
Makes
And
sense.
in the book, you'll see I go bowling and drink beers with Randy Reddy. I go to an art gallery with Jaime Kokenauer. I get a hitting lesson from Rance Mulliniks. Um, I go eat Italian food with Lee Mazzilli. So I do all these different things, which I think makes it again a more interesting story than just sitting down and doing just an interview.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
you
think.
know,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Derek. You go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say a lot of us fans, we think of them as like I guess like we're teachers. Brett and I are both teachers, so our kids literally think that we're at the school all the time. Sometimes it's like
Yeah.
when they see a story, you're like, wait,
Yeah, you don't
don't
exist outside the classroom.
right. And so the players, I guess a lot of us fans, we don't think that they have like personal lives or they go through personal struggles like that. And from what it sounds like, you actually got to look at some of the struggles these players had after baseball. And
Yeah.
I know that a few years ago, there was a whole bunch of issue with the veterans and the current players not wanting to something about their retirement benefits or something. But I think a lot of people forget about the older players because right now like especially young generation. So what I'm trying to say is this a book for the older fans who may have watched that, or do you think that a 20-year-old or 16-year-old would like this book too?
I mean, again, I think anyone who just likes a good human interest story will like this, which I think it has that broad appeal. But within the baseball demographic, I think the sweet spot is like guys between the age of 36 and 48, basically. Because this generation that I'm writing about, they're the last generation before the internet. And so they're the last generation before, the FU kind of money that players made and everyone having their Twitter account. I mean, these are guys that still had to think about what am I going to do when I retire? Am I going to have a job in the off season? That kind of thing. I mean, Richie Hebner dug graves in the off season in his career, right? So it's a bit of that era. But to your point also about, yeah, I think I mean, one of the things I think people will take out of the book is that it actually makes you feel closer to players as people. And we spend so much time, especially in baseball, analyzing these guys and their statistics and hyperventilating about all the little minutia of them from a quantitative perspective. But when you read about these guys as people, it gives you a different perspective the next time you go to the ballpark and you see someone getting booed and you think about, okay, like, yeah, you're booing them and they may act like they don't hear that, but they hear it and it hurts their feelings and they're just people, right? And so the way that I describe it is because these were literally the guys that I idolized as a kid, that era. So I say that after writing this book, I idolize them less but respect them more.
It's been my experience because I mean I'm 45 now, and so I could still to this day, if I were to see any of the current Astros like at HEB or at the mall or somewhere, I would be like, oh my gosh, I want to go talk to them, I want to get a picture with them, I want to get their autograph. I kind of go like fanboy on them. I guess I still had that kind of like that mentality from when I was a child. But years ago, I was in Arizona. My friend was actually serving as a pastor there, and he grew up with Woody Williams. Woody Williams was playing with the Cardinals. I'll make this real short. I was going to go to a game. I had forgotten my friend was there. We connected, and I said, "Hey, I got tickets to the Cardinals game. Doesn't Woody play for me?" It's like, "Oh yeah, he's pitching that game, and if you hang out with us, we can go meet Woody Williams outside the clubhouse. Maybe you can meet some of the players and get some autographs." I'm like, "Cool." He calls me the night before and he says, "Guess where I'm at?" I said, "I don't know. Where are you?" He said, "I'm having dinner with the St. Louis Cardinals." I said, "You're what?" He goes, "Yeah, I'm sitting here at Texas Roadhouse with the St. Louis Cardinals." I go, "Why didn't you invite me?" He goes, "Because you would talk about baseball the whole time. They don't want to talk about baseball. They want to talk about their families. They want to talk about their kids. They want to talk about how they can't wait
Well,
for. And so he just said they're people, and you would be like the party pooper.
yeah.
And
Right. Well, it's if I was doing a book about teachers, and interviewing you guys, you probably wouldn't want to just talk more after school about teaching, right? You want to,
Right.
I mean, you want to talk about other, and that's the thing is like you realize that we're all curious about what these guys are like, but just like every profession, like when you have, teachers, some teachers are jerks, some teachers are really nice, some every profession, some baseball players are jerks, some baseball players are good guys. Like it's not any different than any other job in that sense.
So I'm assuming that you're a Phillies fan growing up.
Yeah, I grew up a Philly fan. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you don't have any hatred towards Astros with the whole scandal
Well,
or
the thing is, I live in Oakland now, so
oh, okay, never
there
mind.
is some of that Oakland. That's a new rivalry, but no, man. I mean, I actually. Well, what's funny about this book is that when I took the trip, it was 2015, so the book is set in the present tense in 2015, and I had this whole because I go to Houston trying to talk to Gary Pettis, and I have a whole chapter about the Astros basically, where I talk about the Astros being this kind of small market, or, fairly small market team that's never won a World Series. And I even make the statement that like fans have no reaction to the Astros. Like general baseball fans they don't really have strong feelings about the Astros because they're just sort of this under the radar team. And of course, all of this is now completely outdated because they win the World Series in 2017 and the scandal stuff. So it's already kind of out of date. But from the perspective of 2015, I think it's pretty accurate. The Astros were not, really that heavily discussed. And the Astros actually come back later in the book because I also go to Cooperstown to find Carlton Fisk again after my golf course adventure. And because he goes to sign autographs for the weekend. And that's when was it Biggio was getting inducted,
Okay.
I believe. And so Cooperstown was overrun with Astros fans. So I talk about the Astros again there. So yeah, it's a fun chapter, and it's also kind of just funny at how out of date that information now is.
You totally took my lead in. That was perfect. I was kind of getting you to go that way, but my Cooperstown story is I was so excited. I was up there for a Bagwell. I mean, it's not that I didn't like Biggio, but I really wanted to save my money for when Bagwell went in because Bagwell was the reason why I like baseball. I don't know. It was just something about him, and maybe it was the stance. I don't know. Maybe it was
Yeah.
just somebody I just really grew up and like, oh, this is a guy I like to watch baseball with. But I was this first time I was in Cooperstown, and this guy's been interviewed right next to me, and I'm like, oh, I wonder who this is. It was Tim Raines.
Oh wow.
And so the next day I'm like, oh, I could have talked to him. I could have
Right.
said hi or something. But
Right.
but yeah, it was Cooperstown is a great place, and I'm sure if there was as many people, I think there's a lot of people there for Biggio for sure, because he was the first true Astro to get into the Hall of Fame
Yeah.
wearing Astros hat. So Bagwell, there's a lot of people there, and I think Brandon and I went, my Talking Stros co-host, and we got to meet Larry Durker, Jose Cruz, and I got a picture with Tal Smith. I don't know if you know him, but he was like one of the executives with the Astros for a while there. He was the reason why Tal's Hill was out there. But so yeah, that's awesome that you actually got to pursue this. And like, if you had family, maybe that would have been a little bit harder, but that's just awesome that you're able to just go out and do this. And so, where can people find your book at?
Sure, thanks. You can go to waxpackbook.com, but it's everywhere you find books. Amazon, your local bookstore will either, if they don't have it, they can order it. So yeah, it's really exciting. It's been out for a few months now and it's done really well. So it's been really nice to see that, and so I hope people will check it out.
I think what's neat about the guys that you interviewed, I'm looking at the list of names, you know, Peddleton, Randy Reddy, Vince Coleman, Dwight Gooden, Mazzilli, Fisk, Yeager, Sutcliffe. Those were different ball players back then. Those were tough guys. Those were, baseball players were hard nosed. I mean, I remember looking up to guys like George Brett, who was a Kansas City Royal. I remember him charging out of the dugout after the Pine Tar home run. I mean, I remember those things. I remember the toughness and the grittiness. I remember when Spike Owen was visiting with the Montreal Expos in the Astrodome, and a guy threw a beer on Spike Owen, and Spike Owen pulled the guy out of the stands onto the field.
Wow.
And they arrested the guy. And it was just a different time. And so for you growing up and for us being in that time, in that era, it must have been pretty awe-inspiring to hear these tough guys share these vulnerable stories and kind of break down that facade of I'm this tough major leaguer to I'm this real guy and I've got these issues. And that must have been astounding to just sit there and listen to.
Yeah, that's really well said. And maybe the best example of that is Steve Yeager, who was a catcher for the Dodgers for years, known as one of the toughest guys in baseball, broke pretty much everything in his body at some time. And I asked him about some of the new rules, and he said, you know, he didn't like the rule about you can't block home plate, because he said, it all those concussions that I got and all those home plate collisions, it makes me feel like, what did I do that for? You know, if now it's not even part of the game. And so, yeah. And then someone like Yeager, who's, again, he is a tough guy. He's a confident guy. He is all of that. But at the same time, within a short amount of time of meeting him, he was telling me about how his father, the first time he watched him play in Cincinnati, got so drunk he passed out in the clubhouse of the team, just passed out drunk, and what it was like having an alcoholic father. And you know, so that kind of stuff you would never read in the newspaper, and you would not expect necessarily him to share that. But that juxtaposition of the tough guy, but then this is the guy that's, you know, really was really hurt by his relationship with his dad. But then I also got to see, he owns a sub shop now in the San Fernando Valley, and I got to see him and his son, who's a college catcher, and how close they are and the close relationship they have. And it was very uplifting to see, you know, him not making the same mistakes that were made with him with his dad.
So kind of going back to your what you said about you don't really like this collecting the stars cards.
Yeah.
Just funny little story real quick. I used to love JT Snow cards. I don't know why. I just loved his name.
Great name.
And I'm like, that's a perfect name. And
I mean,
Tim Solomon.
If I was gonna have like a writer pen name, if he didn't exist, I would say JT Snow would be a great name.
Yeah, isn't that just awesome? I would go to this card shop and this guy would be like, "Hey, I saved you some JT Snow." Now I'm like, why? He wasn't even that good. I just like the name, but yeah, it's amazing how I used to collect Braves pitchers like Glavine and Smoltz and Maddox, just because I mean I had my Astros collection, but I always appreciated what the Braves threw out there, and except when they're playing Astros, that's a different story. But yeah, it's just amazing that you did all this, and it's was it pretty expensive trip, or were you pretty much
well, even again, I was staying in some pretty crappy motels, but I had to invest or spend about
right
$8,000 to do this. So it was over 7 weeks. I drove 11,341 miles in my 2002 Honda Accord. So it was a lot of gas and lodging and food and all that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That would have definitely, that just seems like any baseball junkie's just dream come true. And, you know, talking about this collecting cards growing up, I was very fortunate that my father wanted to get back into it because he remembered what it was like collecting cards. And he told me the stories of how, like, I can't believe I put the Mickey Mantle on the spokes of my bike and you know, where it would make sounds on my bike where he didn't think they would be worth anything.
Yeah.
And so we would go to the card shows, we would go to the card shops, we would go and get that gum and you know, eat that nasty chalky gum. I mean, even a day old, it was horrible. But at the end of the day, I just look back and there were so many memories that the book brings up for me back when I was a child. Speaking of Tim Raines, I used to write players all the time.
Oh yeah, I did that
and
too.
I would put a card in an envelope and send it away. My favorite player growing up was Mark McGwire. I sent him a card. I didn't get the card back. I got a black and white facsimile signed Mark McGwire card with like a Stan Javier and a Dave Stewart baseball card. I think they put the wrong cards in. And then I think I sent to Vince Coleman, never got anything from him, but I sent something to Tim Raines when he was with the Expos, and he sent it back, and it was signed with a Sharpie, and I still have it in one of my binders.
Yeah.
And that to me is one of my most prized autographs. I mean, it took like 3 or 4 months to get it back, but I remember because we didn't have the internet growing up, so I couldn't go online and look up stadium addresses. I had to figure out how to get the stadium address for that player and then write them,
Yellow
and learn
book,
how to write. Yeah, I don't even know how I found it. I don't know. I
yellow
mean,
pages. Is that what it's called? I don't know. I just remember it being as a paperweight or something.
yeah, I don't remember. I think, yeah, I don't know. I remember I had a list. Someone had given me a paper with a list of all the stadium addresses. And I think it was at a card show one time, like a guy's like,
Oh, that
hey
makes
kid,
sense.
write the players. And he had some lists, but cards are just something that they've really come back. But man, it is a whole different market now. It is a big time money making market. It's the high end cards, the autographs, the limited edition. And it's really hard to keep up with. And a lot of kids that collect today, it's
They're
hard for
doing
them to have
Pokemon
fun with
cards.
it.
They're doing
Well, I
Pokemon
mean,
cards. I
yeah,
know.
well, I mean, it's hard for them to collect the baseball cards because they're so expensive now.
Right.
Right.
I mean, so
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts about the '90s cards? Like, you can't see it, but that's a huge closet. Brett has seen it, but I have baseball cards all lined up over there, and they're all '90s cards. And people are like, they're not worth that much because they mass produced them. So,
Yeah.
is that something that you think was bad for the baseball card industry, or good?
Well, I mean, everyone has their own connection to baseball, and if if you love '90s cards, that's awesome. Like that's your thing, right? But I do think that from an economics point of view, it was a classic example of supply and demand and a market crashing because of overproduction. One of the things I did for the book is I actually went to the town in Pennsylvania where the Topps factory used to be. And I actually tracked down four former employees that were
Wow.
actually the people that manufactured the cards on the assembly line in 1985. And so the book opens and closes with those people. And the book opens set in late 1985, and I actually interviewed them about how they physically made the cards. And then the book ends with me. I went and talked to these people, and they had this little reunion together. And it's just amazing how the people that literally made the cards, how special their experience at Topps was, and how the baseball card industry, we don't really think about the people that actually made the cards, but they were very close to each other. They loved their company. It was something that they worked there for a long period of time, and even getting them together 30 some years after they made the cards, you could still see how much they loved each other. And so I wanted to end the book that way because one of the points I wanted to make was that baseball brings people together in way beyond the people that play the game. There's all these other effects, and that the greatness of baseball is that these relationships that people build with each other that are not just about the players themselves.
So I guess my question is to kind of close out the show is, do you have any more unopened packs, and is there going to be a part 2?
Yeah. It's funny. I was going to do this big cross country book tour this summer, where I had bought all these wax packs and I was going to use them and kind of sign them and give them out. But with COVID, that didn't happen, unfortunately. So I still have lots of packs. I don't think I'm going to do a sequel just because I feel like most sequels, they don't measure up to the original, So I would like to do some writing in the future about other players from that era, but I think doing the same exact idea again would not be creatively very interesting.
Speaking of which, and Brett, you can close the show after this. Don't do another Astros documentary because I'm sure there's a whole bunch of people doing that, like about the Astros cheating scandal. So that's not original. So move on from that. So
yeah.
Brett, go ahead.
No, I just appreciate you doing this. You doing something that I think probably just about any one of us in our demographic would just love to do. Talking to players, and I remember just recently, I guess a couple years ago, our neighbor where we used to live, her dad was Bob Lee, and Bob Lee was a pitcher for the Angels. He holds a couple of records for the Angels, and I remember getting to meet him for the first time, and he told stories of facing, Sandy Koufax and Mickey Mantle and Harmon Killebrew and all these guys, and how they used to like jaw back and forth on the mound.
Yeah.
And he said he actually, in a spring training game, he hit because it was a National League game and it was against the Dodgers. And Sandy Koufax was talking crap about how he was working on some spin or working on a curve or something. He's like, well, bring it. And but one thing he told me was he had Mickey Mantle's number, and he told Mickey Mantle, I'm going to strike you out, SOB, this time. I'm going to strike you out. And he said Mantle never got one over on me. He never got a hit. And it was just cool to hear that. And so it's neat that you're able to encapsulate this into a book and take real stories from real players and make the game of baseball real. And baseball needs more of this, because I think baseball has a very hard time marketing itself, and I don't know why. But baseball needs more people like you out there. So hopefully you keep catching this attention, and maybe spark some more ideas, and maybe MLB brings you on or something.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Yeah, I appreciate that. And thanks. I really appreciate you guys having me on.
No problem. And definitely, as soon as Brett is done with his, I'm going to go ahead and read it. And I'm looking forward to it. And thanks for coming. And once again, where can they find you on Twitter? And what's the title of your book?
Sure. It's The Wax Pack on the Open Road in Search of Baseball's Afterlife. And you can find me at Waxpack Book on Twitter or waxpackbook.com. And I'd love to hear from readers.
All right, guys. So go get your copy and just tell your friends, because in a time where we got madness all around us, this is a way for you to kind of look backwards and kind of reflect on what it used to be in baseball, and not always dealing with who gets the most money and everything. So great job. And I really appreciate you coming on. And maybe we'll have you on down the road, and we'll talk about your next book.
All right. Thanks again, guys.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Guys, don't forget to check us out on the daily Locked On Astros podcast, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.